So let's hear Sheela Mahadevan with her paper Practices Theory, Developing Translation Theory Through the Practice of Literary Translation. And Duncan will join us later.
Thank you very much for the introduction. I'm just going to try and share my screen. Is that all?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. So my paper is entitled Practice as Theory, Investigating Intersections Between the Theory and Practice of Literary Translation in relation to Ari Gautier's Carnet Secret de Lakshmi. Divides between theory and practice in translation studies persist, despite Susan Bassnett's statement in 2013 that there needs to be more thought given to linking theory with practice. So this paper explores various ways in which the practice of literary translation may be connected to theory in relation to the contemporary Indian Francophone novel entitled Carnet Secret de Lakshmi by Pondicherry writer Ari Gautier, published in 2018. The novel is set in Pondicherry, a former French colony of India. So I shall firstly explore how the theory and practice of translation intersect within the novel. And I will then examine how the practice of translation may be connected to the act of theorization by reflecting on my process of translating the novel into English. Theory may, of course, be defined in various ways. And so in the first part of this paper, I shall adopt part of the definition of theory proposed by the translator and translation theorist James Holmes. That is, theory is an explanation of translation and translating processes. And in the second part of the paper, I shall consider theory to mean a way of seeing, in light of Rosemary Arojo's suggestion that we might consider the notion of theory more broadly, and in turn would be compatible with the etymology of theory, that is a way of seeing or looking. And so, reflecting on my process of translating Gautier's novel into English, I shall ask, how can the practice of translation be employed as a tool to observe the under-theorized politics and complexities of translating between French and English in the post-colonial Indian context, in addition to the strategies which may be employed to address these issues? And so I shall begin by investigating how theory is connected to the practice of translation within the novel itself. Gautier's Carnet Secret de Lakshmi is a site of translation, for Gautier engages in a practice of transcreation, a term which has emerged in India in recent decades to describe creative translations of the ancient Sanskrit spiritual texts into modern Indian languages. And Gautier employs a poetics of transcreation by creatively translating, transforming, and embellishing various aspects of the ancient Sanskrit epic, the Mahabharata, in his novel. However, not only are lines between fiction and translation blurred in Gautier's novel, but lines between fiction, translation, and theory are also fluid. For Gautier's act of creative translation is closely connected to the theorization of this very process in one particular scene. In the 6th chapter, Gautier uses a poetics of transcreation to creatively translate the philosophy of reincarnation from the Mahabharata into his novel. And the concept of reincarnation from the text is initially translated into French in Gautier's novel as follows. À la façon d'un homme qui, ayant rejeté des vêtements usagés, en prend d'autres neufs, l'âme incarnée rejetant son corps usé, voyage dans d'autres qui sont neufs. So just as a man discards his worn clothes and adopts new garments, the soul similarly discards its body and migrates. In fact, is subsequently dramatized, embellished, and transformed with the addition of new characters and a new plot line through a poetics of transcreation in Gautier's work. And in Gautier's dramatization of this philosophy, a kingfisher transfers his soul to a fish and perishes and re-emerges in the reincarnated form of a flying fish. And what is striking is that Gautier's creative translation of this aspect of the Mahabharata is closely connected to a theorization and explanation of this very process. The depiction of the reincarnation of the kingfisher may be seen to illustrate and explain the process of transformation which the Mahabharata undergoes in Gautier's creative translation process. So the reincarnation of the kingfisher is a metaphor for Gautier's process of transcreation. Just as the Mahabharata is transformed, renewed, and reincarnated with a new appearance and new characters in this scene, so too is the kingfisher reborn with new features, the body of a fish, new functions, and the ability to swim in the deepest of oceans. So the process of transcreation is theorized as a process of reincarnation in the scene, and theory and practice are interwoven. Transcreation is presented as an act of literary reincarnation. And the interrelation between Indian translation traditions and the philosophy of reincarnation has been observed by numerous scholars. Ganesh Devi, for example, suggests that the concept of rebirth bears a significant influence on the Indian literary tradition, as a consequence of which literatures are constantly reborn in new forms via processes of translation. He observes that elements of plot, stories, characters could be used again and again by new generations of writers, because Indian literary theory does not lay undue emphasis on originality. And in that sense, Indian literary traditions are essentially traditions of translation. And similarly, G. Gopinathan employs the metaphor of rebirth to theorize the process of transcreation. Yet Gautier's theory of transcreation, Carnet Secret de Lakshmi, as an act of reincarnation is distinctive, for the theory is enacted in practice within the same work. Gautier's novel is not explicitly presented as a mode of translation theory or translation, and nor does the writer consciously connect theory to practice within his work. But the reader may consciously interpret the work as a mode of translation theory, intentionally connecting the theory of translation to its practice. And in this interpretation, the scene may be interpreted as an illustrated guide to transcreation, in which the practice illustrates the theory, and the theory illustrates the practice. The connection between theory and practice enhances existing understanding of the process of transcreation. It is a practice which blurs boundaries between translation and creative writing, and which complicates and interrogates the notion of originality. And in light of this phenomenon, we may more extensively adopt alternative methodologies for the theorization of translation processes. Although James Holmes suggests that the theorization of translation requires the involvement of practicing translators, in an extensive series of type investigations into the ways in which translators actually work, Gautier's work reminds us that we may interpret the novel as a laboratory in which the writer translates and also potentially theorizes. And even if the theory of translation is not present within fictional works, a more extensive analysis of translation processes within fiction could offer new insights into the ways in which translation and creative writing intersect, and also cast fresh light on other aspects of translation, such as self-translation. Gautier's novel, for example, is a site of self-translation, in which the writer translates between various Indian languages and French. And this phenomenon contradicts the notion that self-translation involves the composition of two separate texts. Here, the process occurs within one sole text. So a more extensive analysis of translation process within fictional works may open up new ways of thinking about various aspects of translation, which may contribute to the development of translation theory. I have so far suggested that Gautier's text comprises of various modes of translation, and it also engages with issues of translation. And in the second part of the paper, I shall reflect on my own practice of translating the work into English, exploring how the practice of translation may be used as a means of theorizing or seeing the politics, paradoxes, and culturally sensitive issues which arise when translating the Indian Francophone novel into English, in addition to the strategies which may be adopted to address them. So the first stage of the translation process involved research into the novel's political and historical context, including the former and current status of English and French in India, the legacy left by the French Empire in India, and acts of French heritage preservation which are currently underway in Pondicherry. I shall firstly discuss this before examining the political and cultural significance of the novel in relation to its context, and then I'll explore what this means for the process of translating the work into English. French and English were once rival colonial tongues of India, echoing the rivalry and tensions between the two empires. The British Empire governed a significant proportion of the Indian territory, and the French Empire, which governed 5 comptoir territories scattered across India, which can be seen on this map, was constantly under threat from the British Empire. And Pondicherry itself, although primarily governed by the French, was occupied on several occasions by the British. And so, reflecting this power dynamic, although French was a colonial language of certain regions of India, it did not have the same dominant status as the English language. And in fact, French may be considered to be an oppressed or even colonized language of India, in addition to a colonial language, in light of these former politics. And even today, French is significantly overshadowed by English in contemporary India. Unlike English, which is an official language of India with a pan-Indian status, French is no longer an official language of any part of India, despite the fact that the French Empire governed regions of India for almost 3 centuries. And consequently, India's main literary organization, the Sahitya Academy, which awards a significant literary prize for Indian writers each year, does not even recognize French as a literary language of India. Despite the fact that a minority of writers such as Gautier adopt French as their contemporary India, the readership of such literature is also limited in this nation. And not only is the status of the French language precarious in India, but architectural traces of the French Empire have also been eroded from Pondichéry's landscape. French colonial buildings such as the town hall have been neglected and have run to ruin. French road signs have been renamed. And countering these processes of erosion in contemporary Pondichéry, attempts are underway to memorialize the French colonial past of the town. French colonial buildings are currently being restored in the landscape of Pondichéry, but are also enacted through literary processes. Gautier's Carnet Secret de Lakshmi may be interpreted as a site of French heritage preservation. Its narrative restores the linguistic and architectural traces of the French Empire. We learn, for example, that the Rue Manakula Vinayaga underwent processes of translation during the colonial and post-colonial periods. Formerly had 2 French names. It was once known as the Rue de Tisserand and then became the Rue d'Orléans, and before adopting its current name. And so the former French road names of this road sign, its translational history, which have been erased from Pondichéry's landscape, are revealed and restored in the work. And the adoption of the French language in the novel may also be interpreted as an act of memorialization of Pondichéry's French history. For as Siobhan Brownlee suggests, the memory of the past and traditions are embedded in language and in linguistic products, and the act of writing in French counters the loss of the colonial language of India, restores the French past of the town through a linguistic and literary medium. And the act of writing in French in Carnet Secret de Lakshmi also enacts a political agenda. It challenges the dominant status of English in India. It draws visibility to the existence of an Indian Francophone corpus, which is frequently overlooked, for it is overshadowed by a much larger corpus of Indian English literature in the contemporary Indian literary landscape. And so what does it mean to translate Gautier's novel into English in this context and in light of all these issues? The translator faces a number of paradoxes, tensions, and complexities, in addition to numerously politically and culturally sensitive issues which are to be negotiated. On the one hand, there is a need to translate the work into English so that it can reach a wider audience, not only internationally, but also within India, where there are few French speakers. But on the other hand, by bringing the work to a wider audience through the act of translating the work into English, might not the paradoxically iterate certain cultural text of the source text. For if Gautier's adoption of French as a literary language memorializes the French past of Pondichéry, and also has the effect of challenging the dominance of English in India and the effect of making visible the existence of French as an Indian literary language, are not all these effects erased through the process of translating the work into English? And the transfer from French to English in this translation process could paradoxically perpetuate the unequal statuses of these languages rather than challenging them as the source text does. So the act of translating Gautier's novel to English may involve the potential loss of political effect. As I translated the novel, I wondered how to negotiate these issues and whether certain translation strategies might be adopted to echo the effects of the source text. I attempted to write a multilingual translation, preserving certain French words in the English translation, such as rue, pâtisserie, quartier blanc, and triste. I also adopted the French spelling of Pondichéry rather than Pondicherry, and I retained the French transliteration of Indian place names, such as Vaitekupam and Kurusakupam, rather than using English transliteration, so as to echo Gautier's act of French heritage preservation in the source text. And this act of memorialization is especially conspicuous and visible in the translation, for the French words, the linguistic monuments to the French colonial past, are highlighted by the English vocabulary which surrounds them. So the practice of translating the novel illuminates the potential role of the translator as a restorer of a fading colonial legacy, which may be enacted through the composition of a multilingual translation. And moreover, through the process of translating the novel in this way, I was able to observe that the inclusion of the French vocabulary in the English translation enacts a distinct power dynamic. The French vocabulary resists and challenges the dominant English language, echoing one of the political effects of Gautier's French writing. And if the French language is considered to be a colonized language of India, as I suggested earlier, this translation strategy I have adopted could also be interpreted as a practice of decolonization, which challenges the dominance of English and liberates the French language. And so this practice of translation opens up an alternative way of seeing how translation can enact processes of decolonization. In the Indian context, the process may be enacted not merely by retaining indigenous Indian languages, but also by retaining a European colonial language, namely French, in the English translation. So the process of translating Gautier's novel, including the research involved in the process, is an effective means of theorizing the under-examined and distinctive politics and complexities of translating Indian Francophone literatures into English, in addition to casting light on the strategies which may be adopted to address them. And this process could lead to the formulation of alternative theories of translation. And the practice of literary translation may be used more extensively as a tool to observe other aspects of translations. For example, the complexities of translating multilingualism. Many Indian literatures, such as Gautier's novel, are multilingual, comprising of several languages, in addition to dialects or creoles, or modes of language which inhabit the spaces between languages. Might the practice of translating such works cast new light on the processes and challenges of translating multilingualism, and might this methodology enable us to test and rethink existing translation theories? And the practice of translating multilingual literatures itself may also cast new light on the complexities of theorizing multilingualism. And so finally, I'd like to recall the words of the Indian writer and translator Dilip Chipre, who argues in his essay on translation entitled Life on the Bridge, that translation is an activity of doubtful theoretical validity. Conversely, it appears that the practice of literary translation may be considered as an act of theorization, a way of observing under-theorized aspects of translation. And this may offer new ways of thinking about translation, new insights, and this may lead to the development of translation theory. Thank you. So I'll just stop sharing my screen.
Sorry, I muted myself. So Sheela, thank you very much for the very, very interesting paper, and problems that problems not always in the bad way, but it's interesting way. I would never have thought about Franco literature in Indian, and because it's not my area of expertise, but for example, in Russian culture, they have, since it is big country with many different languages, they also the translation inside the country also help developing theoretical theory and translation per se. Are there any questions for Sheela from the audience? I don't see anything in chat room, but maybe I just don't see. Do we have somebody waving or doing one new message? Let me see. Barbara, she asks where can she read more of your work, Sheela, and that is the question that interests all of us. So please, Sheela, where?
Thank you for the really interesting question, Barbara. The translation itself that I discussed in the paper hasn't been published. It's so I translated the novel essentially as a sort of I suppose for my research to test whether what light this sort of process of translation could shed on issues of translation, such as I mean, it makes us think beyond obviously translation as a process from going from one language to another, because obviously I adopted multilingualism as a strategy, but also the text was multilingual. So it was, and of course, I translated the novel also to explore the kind of the political aspects of translating multilingualism. And so the novel itself has not been published. It's still part of my research, but I have written a paper based on my translation processes and my reflections on translating multilingualism, and that is forthcoming, but that also is yet to be published. So I don't. That's a good question. Will you be pitching and looking for a publisher? I will be. It's still, I suppose, a translation is, like everyone says, is never finished, only ever abandoned. And so at the moment, it's still sort of in a draft stage. And one of the things, it's interesting you raised that question, because one of the things that that occurred to me is obviously certain publishers don't like multilingualism within translations and prefer to, and feel that that sort of subversive use of language perhaps makes the text less accessible to readers. And so it will be interesting to see how, when I do pitch my work to publishers, how my use of multilingualism will be perceived by publishers.
Well, small publishers are willing to take more risks, says Barbara. And Atul Kumar asked, how does your translation of this novel fit into the post-colonial theories of translation? I would love to hear your views regarding this.
Thank you, Atul. That's a really interesting question. What struck me when I looked at sort of research on post-colonial translation, particularly relating to the Indian context, is that most research focuses on a transfer between Indian languages and English. And of course, English is the major link language in India. It's the medium by which various regional languages of India sort of get translated via English into other Indian languages. And so a lot of people had looked at the politics and sort of the theories. They based their theories based on the power dynamics between indigenous Indian languages and English. And to me, it seemed interesting that French hadn't really been looked at, the transfer between French and English in the Indian context. And in terms of how it relates to existing post-colonial theory of translation in the post-colonial Indian context, it offered a new dimension, a possibility of thinking that a decolonial or decolonizing translation practice might be enabled not only by retaining Indian indigenous languages in the translation, but also by retaining French, which has this slightly compromised, oppressed status in India. It's sort of a defeated colonial language in many senses, and so it offered a new way of theorizing or thinking about that politics.
Well, Una asks, she's curious whether in your translation you used any visual markers, for example, italics, to mark the French you retained. I will add just that before, for example, in Tolstoy's War and Peace, since it was then in Russian culture normal to speak in French, so he had in his Russian mostly text many French, and it was contained in the Croatian translation, and then in notes it was then translated. So Barbara then adds about some works. I'm not going to read that, but what about that, Sheena, Sheila, did you use some italics or something? What do you think about that?
That's a really interesting question. Thank you. I think I'm still wondering about the use of italics to kind of highlight in a visual sense the multilingualism in the translation. What I didn't have time to mention in my paper was that there are also a number of Indian languages contained within the source text, which I have also retained in the English translation. So there's a question of whether I choose italicization, say, for the Indian languages or a specific Indian language, or for the French, and what kind of effect that has visually and in terms of power dynamic, because also among the Indian languages that are used, there's Hindi, which has a sort of a kind of dominant status, a pan-Indian status within India. It's an official language of India, whereas there is also Tamil, which is a South Indian language, and that has a kind of sort of almost a minority status, I suppose, across the whole of India. And so there's a question of whether I should italicize certain languages and others perhaps less so, or entirely erase the sort of italicism, and then sort of just have a kind of uniform approach, because nevertheless I think the multilingualism is quite conspicuous. And one thing relating to that is also a question of the target audience, because I think one complexity is translating for an Indian audience as well as an international audience, and how the use of italicization sort of is kind of related to that as well. And certain words that occur to me, like patisserie in say a European context, it almost don't really stand out as multilingual. That doesn't really stand out perhaps as multilingualism, because such words are perhaps quite commonplace, but a word like patisserie in the Indian context, for example, might well be more sort of visible. And so multilingualism means different things in different contexts. And according to that, that also complicates the decision as to whether or not to use italics. So that's something that I'm currently thinking about, but it's a really important and interesting question. Thank you.
Great. Okay, I'm not going to read all the comments and all the very interested discussion that is in the chat. If there are no more questions that are talking to each other and to us, which is great, because please don't forget to copy these interesting links and everything. So I think that maybe for now, Sheela will say thank you for your very, very interesting paper.